They said no one could survive that fire, that everything inside was gone. But when the smoke cleared, a tiny heartbeat was still fighting, and in his hands a rosary that refused to burn. Sometimes what the world calls tragedy is where miracles are born. The North Yorkshire coast has a way of holding secrets. Whitby, perched on its cliffs, is a place where history clings to the stone like salt spray, centuries of stories layered upon centuries. But not all stories are the kind that make it into the guidebooks. Some are whispered in kitchens, behind closed doors, in the spaces between what people see and what they choose not to acknowledge. Oliver Bennett was 4 years old and already skilled at disappearing. The cottage sat perhaps 2 miles outside Whitby proper, accessible by a narrow lane that twisted like intestines through moorland. It was the sort of house that looked charming in estate agent photographs, but felt isolating once you actually lived there. The previous occupants had painted it a soft cream color, but the moorland wind and salt air had rendered it grey, as if the building itself was giving up. Oliver's mother, Elena, had chosen it for the peace. Before the cancer began its methodical work, she would sit in the small garden and read. She had a way of making even grief look beautiful, the way light touched her dark hair, the careful arrangement of her fingers around a cup of tea, the patient smile she offered everyone, even as her body betrayed her. That was 18 months ago. Now Thomas Bennett worked in Liverpool, nearly 90 minutes away by train. He had not wanted to leave. He had sat beside Elena's hospital bed in her final hours, holding her hand, and promised he would take care of their son. But grief has a way of clarifying priorities in unexpected directions. Work became an escape. The dockyard became a cathedral where he could worship the god of busyness, where no one asked how he was managing, because the assumption was that he wasn't managing at all, he was simply enduring. Margaret had arrived on a Tuesday in early March, introduced by a well-meaning aunt as someone who could help with Oliver. She was 43, with the kind of efficiency that came from having been disappointed by life multiple times. She had been married before, she explained. She understood loss. She understood boys. She was, she promised, exactly what they needed. Thomas believed her because he needed to believe her. The alternative was acknowledging that he couldn't manage alone, that his son required more than a distant father could provide from across the Pennings. Margaret had moved into the cottage with the deliberation of someone claiming territory. She had painted over Elena's choices, literally, in some cases, redecorating the sitting room in shades of beige. She had reorganized the kitchen. She had introduced new rules: bedtime at 7 o'clock sharp, breakfast at 6. No playing with toys indoors after 3 in the afternoon. Rules, she explained, were what children needed. Structure, discipline. Oliver had begun sleeping poorly almost immediately. It wasn't dramatic neglect, the kind that leaves bruises visible at the schoolyard. It was something subtler and, in many ways, more insidious. The heating was kept low to save money. Meals were nutritionally adequate, but emotionally cold. Margaret spoke to Oliver in a tone that suggested she was perpetually inconvenienced by his existence, a tone that implied his childhood, his tears, his need for comfort, were each a personal affront. The schoolteacher, Mrs. Catherine Mills, had noticed small things. Oliver was smaller than other children his age. He sat alone during story time, while the other children clustered together. When she asked them to draw their families, Oliver's drawing showed 4 figures, but only 3 were connected by lines. The 4th, presumably his father, stood apart. She had mentioned her concerns to Margaret during the autumn term parents' evening. Margaret had smiled with the precision of a surgeon, and explained that Oliver was simply sensitive, that all boys went through phases, that Mrs. Mills shouldn't worry. Everything was perfectly fine at home. What Mrs. Mills didn't know, couldn't have known without being inside the cottage at night, was how Oliver had developed a ritual. Each evening, when Margaret retreated to the sitting room with a glass of wine, Oliver would wait until her breathing became steady and deliberate. Then he would slip from his bed, still in his pajamas, and move to the small window in his room that overlooked the moorland. The window was cold, and the boy was small, but Oliver didn't seem to mind. He would reach underneath his pillow and remove the rosary his mother had given him 6 weeks before she died. Elena had been Catholic, though not devoutly faith. For her was something gentle and personal. She'd placed the beads in his small hand and told him something he would never forget. When you're scared, my darling, you pray. Not because God always gives you what you ask for, but because prayer reminds you that you're not alone, that someone, somewhere, is listening. And I want you to promise me on this rosary, that you'll never let it go. Even when things are dark, especially then. Oliver had been 3 years old. He hadn't fully understood. But he understood his mother's seriousness, the way her hand trembled slightly as she pressed the beads into his palm. He had promised. Now, holding that same rosary, Oliver would whisper into the darkness of the moorland night, "Mummy, give me strength to last one more day." It was a prayer and a plea. It was the only conversation he had that felt genuine, the only dialogue where he could speak his truth without being corrected or dismissed. And every single night his small fingers would move through each bead, each one a heartbeat, each one a reason to believe that morning would come, that the sun would rise, that somehow, impossibly, he would survive. What Oliver didn't know was that survival, sometimes, isn't about lasting one more day. Sometimes it's about lasting one more hour. Sometimes it's about one single moment of absolute transformation that rewrites everything. That moment was coming. Thomas Bennett had not intended to be an absent father. He'd held Oliver in the hospital immediately after birth and made all the promises that fathers make. He would be present. He would be involved. He would be different from his own father, who had been distant and critical, all stone and silence. But death had a way of rewriting intention into something else entirely. The first sign that something was amiss arrived on a grey Saturday in November. Thomas had taken the early train from Liverpool, arriving at the cottage just after midday. He carried with him a new toy wooden train that had cost more than he should have spent, purchased from a shop in Manchester as a sort of penance for his absence. Oliver had not run to meet him at the door. Instead, the boy had stood quietly in the hallway, regarding his father with eyes that seemed older than 4 years should allow. The rosary was visible on his wrist, worn like a bracelet. "Hello, Dad," Oliver had said, his voice small and careful. Thomas had felt something crack inside his chest. When had his son learned to be so cautious? Margaret had emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a cloth. "He's been an absolute angel," she had said, the words perfectly calibrated to sound genuine while managing to feel somehow accusatory. "Haven't you, Oliver? Tell your father what you did this week." Oliver had looked up at his father, and in that glance, Thomas saw something that troubled him profoundly. It was not fear, precisely. It was something closer to resignation, the look of a child who had learned that the world operated according to rules he hadn't been given access to. "I helped Margaret tidy the garden," Oliver had said, reciting the words with the monotone of a child reading from a script. Thomas wanted to press further, wanted to ask why his son seemed so diminished, wanted to ask why the cottage felt less like a home and more like an institution run by an invisible set of regulations. But Margaret's presence had made such questions seem impertinent, like he was questioning her competence, her care. Over lunch, fish and chips from the local takeaway, eaten somewhat uncomfortably around the kitchen table, Thomas attempted to reconstruct a sense of normalcy. He asked about school. He asked about friends. He asked about books and television programs and any number of surface-level topics designed to generate the kind of conversation that felt like parenting. Oliver had answered each question with the precision of someone being tested. He was doing well at school, he said. He had a friend named Daniel, he said. He liked the programs on Sabibis, he said. All true, Thomas would later learn, but incomplete in ways that mattered. After lunch, Thomas had suggested they build something with Lego. For one brief moment, he had seen Oliver's eyes light up, a flash of genuine interest, but Margaret had intervened gently. "He's actually quite tired today," she had said. "All that helping in the garden. Perhaps he needs a nap before you two play. You'll have better energy then." By the time Oliver woke from his nap, the afternoon had slipped away. By the time Thomas had considered staying for dinner, obligation and exhaustion had convinced him otherwise. He had work in the morning. The train journey home was nearly 2 hours. He needed sleep. He had kissed Oliver on the top of his head, smelling his son's hair, which felt thinner, he thought, though he couldn't be certain, and promised to visit the following weekend. He did not keep that promise. An emergency at the dockyard had required his presence. The following weekend after that, a worker had been injured, and Thomas had needed to fill in for overtime to help cover the shifts. One missed weekend became 2. 2 became 3. Meanwhile, Margaret had continued her methodical work. The rules had become more elaborate. The portions at dinner had decreased incrementally. The physical affection, already minimal, had been replaced with a kind of brittle politeness that felt, to Oliver, like being surrounded by people who could not quite see him. In December, Oliver had come down with a cold. Margaret had kept him home from school, which was standard enough, but she had also limited his access to the sitting room, where the heating was concentrated. Oliver had spent the day in his bedroom in a jumper and a cardigan, waiting for fever dreams to pass. When Mrs. Mills had asked about the absence, Margaret had simply said that Oliver had been unwell. Nothing serious. Mrs. Mills had accepted this without question. In the absence of visible harm, most people accept the explanations offered to them. By January, something had shifted in Margaret's demeanor. She began receiving phone calls that made her angry in a quiet, contained way, low-voiced conversations behind closed doors, hanging up abruptly when Oliver appeared in hallways. Thomas, during one of his increasingly rare visits, had noticed this tension. "Is everything all right?" he had asked Margaret in the kitchen, while Oliver watched television in the other room. "Fine," Margaret had replied, with a brightness that felt like glass. "Just some financial matters. Nothing you need to concern yourself with." Thomas had accepted this at face value. The cottage was paid for by his salary. Margaret's expenses were modest. What financial concerns could there possibly be? What he didn't know was that Margaret had inherited a considerable sum from her first husband money. She had invested with a man she'd met at a pub who had promised extraordinary returns. That man had disappeared 3 weeks earlier, along with 70% of her savings. What he didn't know was that Margaret was experiencing something close to a breakdown, a psychological unraveling that was finding its outlet not in professional help or honest conversation, but in increasingly controlling behavior directed at the only person in her life who couldn't fight back. What he didn't know was that his son was standing at a window every night, holding a rosary and praying for a rescue that would not arrive through conventional channels. The fractures in the foundation were not visible yet, but they were becoming wider. And soon, very soon, they would crack completely, and everything would fall through. February arrived with ice and an unexpected intensity of wind. The moorland transformed into something almost hostile, beautiful in the way that harsh landscapes can be, but fundamentally unwelcoming. The cottage seemed to absorb the cold, despite Margaret's attempts to keep the heating at an economical level. Oliver had begun to present symptoms that, if anyone had been paying attention, would have triggered concern. He was losing weight. His energy, never abundant, had become almost non-existent. At school, he had started falling asleep during lessons, his small head nodding forward before snapping upright, as if his body was betraying him. Mrs. Mills had documented these changes in her observation notes. A good teacher keeps records small details about behavior, physical appearance, emotional markers. Mrs. Mills was more than a good teacher. She was conscientious to the point of obsession. She had flagged Oliver's concerning presentation to the school office in early February. The school office had, in turn, made a phone call to Margaret. "We were just checking in," the administrator had said, her voice careful and professional. "Nothing to worry about, but we've noticed Oliver seems rather tired at school. Is there anything happening at home that we should know about? Illness? Changes in routine? Anything like that?" Margaret's response had been swift and convincing. "In simply growing," she had said. "Growing children get tired. It's perfectly normal. And he does have a small tendency to cough in the mornings. Nothing serious, just the Yorkshire damp, I expect. I'm sure he'll perk up as the weather improves." The call had been logged and filed. The administrator had made a note, and the matter had been considered resolved. What no one could see was what happened in the cottage after school. The way Margaret would respond to Oliver's requests for snacks with sighs of inconvenience. The way she had begun to restrict his access to the kitchen, implementing rules about eating times that meant Oliver often went to bed with an empty stomach. The way she had stopped speaking to him altogether in some moments, communicating only through pointed silences and meaningful stares. It was psychological warfare, conducted at a level so subtle that it left no physical marks, no visible proof. It was the kind of abuse that doesn't register on standard assessments, but that damages a child in ways that last decades. Oliver had begun to retreat further into internal worlds. At school, he would sit in the library during breaks, looking at picture books without seeing them. At home, he had become even more invisible, moving through rooms like a ghost, trying to take up as little space as possible. The rosary had become not a prayer tool, but a lifeline. Every night, Oliver would hold it and whisper to his dead mother, and in those moments of connection, he would receive something that felt like answer. Whether it was genuine divine intervention, or simply the remarkable human capacity to find meaning in ritual, Oliver didn't question. He only knew that those moments made the next day survivable. By mid-February, something else had shifted. Margaret's demeanor had changed from angry to something altogether more dangerous, resolved. It was as if she had made a decision, the way one makes a decision about a difficult problem at work, with the emotional distance of someone merely executing her plan. She began making unusual purchases. A large container of petrol, ostensibly for the garden equipment. A new lock for Oliver's bedroom door, installed while he was at school. Nothing, individually, seemed obviously sinister, but together they formed a pattern. Gon Hartley, the neighbor whose property adjoined the cottage, had noticed some of these changes. He had seen the petrol container. He had seen Margaret moving through her garden with unusual purpose. He had heard, on one occasion, raised voices coming from inside the cottage, Margaret's voice, sharp and bitter, and Oliver's, small and frightened, asking to speak to his father. Doan had considered intervening. He had even picked up the phone once to call Thomas Bennett's number, which was posted on a notice board at the local shop, given for emergencies. But Doan was 73 years old, retired from a lifetime of working in anonymity, and he had learned long ago to mind his own business. He had convinced himself that it wasn't his place, that Margaret was the guardian, that if there were serious concerns, the school or the authorities would have already intervened. It's a calculus that many people make, the choice between involvement and distance, and it almost always results in the same conclusion, that it's not my responsibility, that someone else will surely notice, that stepping in would be an overreach. No one stepped in. On the evening of February 27th, Margaret had prepared dinner, a small portion for Oliver, nothing for herself. She had watched him eat with an expression that suggested she was observing an insect rather than a child. And when he had finished, she had locked his door from the outside and retired to the sitting room with a bottle of wine and a determination that felt like ice. The storm, which had been gathering on the horizon for months, was finally about to break, and no one was ready for it. No one except Oliver, who held his rosary and prayed to a mother who existed now only in memory and faith. "Mummy," he whispered, his voice so quiet it barely disturbed the air. "I think something's going to happen. Please stay with me. Please don't let me be alone." Outside, the wind howled across the moorland like a living thing. And somewhere in that wind, or perhaps nowhere at all, or perhaps everywhere at once, a presence that might have been maternal love seemed to lean closer. It began with shouting. Margaret had gone to Oliver's room after her third glass of wine and accused him of something he hadn't. Done something about missing money, about being ungrateful, about being a burden that his own father had abandoned. The specifics didn't matter. Oliver had learned that Margaret's anger didn't require a coherent cause. It simply required an outlet. He had cowered in the corner of his room, the rosary pressed against his small body like armor, while Margaret stood in the doorway, her face twisted by rage and alcohol. "Your mother's gone," Margaret had hissed. "Your father doesn't want you, and I'm the only one who will ever tolerate your pathetic existence. You understand? You're nothing. You're less than nothing." Then she had left, and he had heard the lock click shut from the outside. Oliver didn't know how long he cried. Doesn't know, still, whether it was minutes or hours. He only knows that his tears eventually ran dry, and he was left in the darkness, holding his rosary, whispering the same prayer he had whispered every night for the past year. "Mummy, give me strength to last one more day." He was asleep when the smell began to seep into his room. At first it was part of his dreams, vague and untethered, but then it became urgent, specific, smoke. He awoke, disoriented, to find grey tendrils curling into his room from beneath the closed door. Oliver's mind, still half asleep, took a moment to process. Then panic arrived with the force of a physical blow. He ran to the door and grabbed the handle. It was locked. He pulled, pounded, screamed, but the lock held. He could hear the sound of crackling from somewhere beyond his room, the methodical sound of fire-consuming wood. "Margaret," he screamed. "Margaret, I'm locked in. Let me out." There was no response. There was only the growing smell of smoke, the increasing heat, the sound of fire growing closer, louder, more real. Oliver ran back to the window. It was small, single-glazed, and it opened only partially, designed for ventilation, not escape. He pushed with all his strength, but it wouldn't open more than a few inches. His fingers, small and weak, found no purchase on the frame. The smoke was thickening. His lungs, unprepared for this, began to burn with each breath. His eyes streamed with tears. The temperature in the room was rising, not slowly, but with terrifying speed. He thought of his mother. He thought of the promise he had made to never let go of the rosary. The beads were still in his hand, the beads that had survived the distance between life and death, that had held his prayers through all the terrible months, that had been his sole connection to love and safety. "Mummy," he cried, his voice barely audible over the roar of the expanding fire. "Mummy, please, I'm scared. Mummy, don't let me be alone. Mummy!" The door frame suddenly cracked, and Oliver's mind, in its terror, latched onto a possibility. Behind his bed, where he stored his few toys, there was a gap where the wood paneling had never fully matched. His small hands, driven by pure instinct, moved there. He pushed against the soft rotted wood, and it gave way. There was a space beneath the floor, ancient, unused, forgotten. Years ago, it had been designed as a storage cellar for the original cottage, built before modern heating systems. It had been closed off, boarded up, left to exist in darkness and neglect. Oliver didn't think. He simply crawled, his small body dragging through the opening. The rosary still clutched in his hand, his lungs screaming for air that didn't burn. He moved through absolute darkness, blind, driven only by the primal need to escape. Above him the fire consumed the room he had slept in, ate through the mattress, devoured the small collection of possessions he had accumulated. The window burst from the heat and pressure. The ceiling cracked and began to collapse. Outside, neighbors had seen the glow of the fire and begun to emerge from their homes. Don Hartley had called 999. Mrs. Catherine Mills, who lived a quarter-mile away, had seen the orange light in the sky and felt something cold move through her chest, but they were all too far away, too late. By the time the first fire engine arrived, the cottage was fully engulfed. The wooden structure, dry and old, had become kindling for a funeral pyre. Firefighter James Walker, arriving with the 2nd Brigade, had looked at the inferno and made the decision that was made in these situations. There was no point in sending anyone in. The structural integrity was compromised. The heat would be lethal. If there was anyone inside, they were already gone. The flames consumed the night. The moorland for one terrible night was lit like day. And beneath the collapsing structure, in a space that had been forgotten for nearly a century, a small boy lay unconscious, still clutching a rosary, still breathing, barely, but breathing. The search had been called off by dawn. Firefighters had sifted through the still smoking remains, looking for human remains, and had found only objects: a child's shoe, fragments of fabric that might have been pajamas, and most notably, a small crucifix, its surface blackened by heat, but unmistakably intact. Someone would later remark that it seemed impossible that such a delicate object could survive such extreme heat. It seemed almost intentional, as though it had been preserved by something other than mere chance. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the fire brigade had made their official determination. There had been a child in the cottage. That child had not survived. The body would likely not be identifiable until professional analysis could be conducted at a later date. James Walker, the firefighter who had made the decision not to enter, would later say that it had been the right call. Sending personnel in would have accomplished nothing except adding to the casualty count. It was logic, it was protocol, but it was also, ultimately, insufficient comfort against the weight of having let a child die. Thomas Bennett received the call at 7 in the morning while he was preparing for a shift at the dockyard. He had listened to the officer's words: fire, suspect circumstances, young child, unlikely survival, and something inside him had simply ceased to function. His body had remained upright. His mouth had continued to move, but somewhere deep inside his consciousness, a door had closed. He had called his employer and told them he wouldn't be coming in. He had called his sister and told her what had happened. Though his voice had sounded like someone else's, he had sat on the edge of his bed and waited for his body to understand that his son was dead. Mrs. Catherine Mills had heard the news through the school's emergency notification system. Official channels, careful language, grief counselors would be available. She had felt physically ill, nausea that had nothing to do with anything physical and everything to do with the sick realization that she had noticed something was wrong, and she had not acted with sufficient conviction. By mid-morning, the news had spread through Whitby like wind. The tragic story of a child lost in a fire at the cottage on the moorland, of neglect and disaster, of a system that had failed to protect its most vulnerable. The outpouring of sympathy was immediate and overwhelming. Flowers were placed at the end of the lane. Candles were lit. The community, in its collective grief, began the process of making meaning from senseless tragedy. What no one could have known, what no one could have anticipated, was that in a particular field, approximately 200 meters from the cottage, a young boy was regaining consciousness. Oliver's return to awareness was not sudden, but gradual. It began with pain, his feet, his hands, his lungs, all of them burning with a sensation that initially seemed indistinguishable from the fire itself. Then came cold, the moorland wind at dawn, cutting through his ash-covered skin, raising goosebumps across his small body. He opened his eyes to a sky that was neither night nor day, but something in between, the liminal space of early morning, where the world exists in shades of grey impossibility. For a moment, he didn't remember. His mind, in its mercy, had shut down the events of the previous night, treating them as something that had happened to someone else. Then his lungs convulsed, and memory returned with violent clarity. He began to move, not consciously, but through the pure animal logic of survival. His body wanted to escape the field, wanted to find shelter, wanted someone. He crawled through the damp grass, still disoriented, his voice producing only small croaks, his throat too damaged by smoke to manage anything more. He became aware gradually that something was still in his hand. Through the blur and confusion, he looked down. The rosary, his mother's rosary. Somehow, miraculously, it had survived. The beads were warm in his palm, and their presence brought with it a clarity that transcended the pain and fear. He was alive. He didn't understand how, but he was alive. And that meant the promise he had made, the promise to never let ghost, held weight. James Walker was conducting a final search of the perimeter, going through the motions of a task that felt pointless but necessary, when he saw movement in the field. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a small shape, grey with ash, moving slowly across the moorland. He approached cautiously, as one approaches something that might be an illusion or a grief-induced hallucination. But as he got closer, the shape resolved into something specific and impossible. A child, small, burned, covered in ash and soot, but alive, unmistakably, against all probability and logic, alive. Oliver saw the firefighter approaching and felt something shift inside him. The fear didn't disappear. The fear was too deep now to disappear, but it transformed into something manageable, into something that might, in time, become hope. James picked him up carefully, aware that the boy might have internal injuries, might be in shock. He wrapped him in his own jacket and moved toward the ambulance that was still parked on the lane. "What's your name?" James asked gently, not expecting a coherent answer, "Oliver," came the small, hoarse reply. "I'm Oliver Bennett. And I didn't let go, like I promised Mummy. I didn't let go." In Oliver's small fist, surrounded by fingers that had survived the impossible, the rosary beads caught the light of the early morning sun. And James Walker, a man who had been a firefighter for 22 years and had made peace with the limitations of his profession, felt something open inside his chest that he couldn't name but recognized immediately as the weight and responsibility of witnessing a miracle. The hospital was understaffed, underfunded, and utterly bewildered by Oliver Bennett. By all medical logic, the child should have suffered severe burns. His lungs should have been damaged beyond recovery. His exposure to smoke should have resulted in severe respiratory compromise. Instead, apart from abrasions on his feet and hands, apart from smoke inhalation that was serious but manageable, Oliver bore the physical scars of fire in a way that defied explanation. The consultant, Dr. Rayesh Patel, had examined the boy thoroughly and then examined him again, looking for injuries he felt certain must exist. There were none. There was profound psychological trauma that would take years to process, but the physical survival was, by any standard of medical probability, inexplicable. Thomas Bennett arrived at the hospital in a state somewhere beyond grief, and into that territory of incomprehension where the mind simply ceases to function in expected patterns. He had been told his son was dead. He had begun the process of accepting that loss. And then he had been told his son was alive, and the scaffolding of acceptance came crashing down. He stood at the entrance to Oliver's hospital room for a long time before entering. When he finally did, he couldn't initially bring himself to approach the bed. He stood at a distance, looking at his small son, this person he had created, who had somehow survived something that by all accounts should have been unsurvivable. Oliver, when he saw his father, didn't reach for him. The trauma ran too deep for immediate comfort. Instead, the boy simply held up his small fist, within which the rosary was visible. "Mummy kept me safe," Oliver said, his voice rough from smoke damage. "She kept me safe like she promised." Thomas moved to the bed and, for the first time in longer than he could remember, simply held his son. Not the careful, measured embrace of a parent trying to be appropriate, but the complete, unguarded grip of a man who had believed he had lost everything and had been given it back. The police investigation, meanwhile, was taking on a different character. Margaret's initial story, that she had been asleep when the fire started, that she had barely managed to escape, that she had assumed Oliver had made it out as well, had been accepted at first. The accident theory was the most convenient. An old cottage with aging electrical wiring, a faulty heating system. Tragic, but not criminal. Then the forensic examination had revealed traces of accelerants. Then the locksmith report had come back, confirming that Oliver's door lock could only be engaged from the outside. Then Don Hartley, emboldened by the revelation that the boy had lived, had finally come forward with his observations about the petrol, about the changed behavior, about the preparations that had seemed orchestrated. By the time Margaret was arrested, the picture had become undeniable. This had not been an accident. It had been something far more calculated. The detective, Inspector Sarah Mitchell, was a woman who had spent 20 years in the force and believed she had seen every permutation of human cruelty. Margaret's case still managed to offend her sense of what was possible. She left him to die, Margaret's solicitor would later argue, attempting to characterize it as negligence rather than attempted murder. She locked him in and set the fire, Inspector Mitchell countered. That's attempted homicide. The only reason it's not successful is because this child survived something statistically impossible. The court case would take months. But the outcome was never in doubt. Margaret would be convicted of attempted murder and sentenced accordingly. What mattered in the immediate aftermath, however, was not the machinery of justice, but the simple fact that Thomas Bennett finally understood what his silence had allowed. That by not being present, by not asking questions, by accepting convenient narratives, he had created a space where a child could be brought to the edge of death. He made a series of decisions in those early days at the hospital. He applied for a transfer to work locally. He requested custody evaluations. He began, in small increments, the process of becoming the father his son needed, rather than the father he had defaulted to being. Oliver, for his part, held his rosary and began the long work of processing trauma that would occupy him for years. A child psychologist, brought in to assess his mental state, had noted that Oliver's resilience seemed almost supernatural, his ability to integrate impossible experiences, his refusal to be defined by what had happened to him. He has an unusual capacity for meaning-making, the psychologist noted in her report. The child seems able to transform his trauma into narrative, to find purpose in survival. It's remarkable, really. Most children would struggle far more than this one. What the psychologist couldn't have mentioned without sounding unprofessional, was the rosary, and the way Oliver would touch it at moments of fear, and the way his deceased mother seemed to be the most present and active force in the boy's processing of events. Some miracles, perhaps, don't require explanation. They only require witness. The cottage was demolished in late April, under careful supervision, with professionals handling the remains with something approaching reverence. There was no body to remove. Oliver's escape had been the only escape. But the structure itself, the physical container of trauma, needed to be eliminated. Thomas Bennett stood at the perimeter, watching the machinery reduce the cottage to rubble, and felt something close to peace. The building that had housed such darkness could not hurt anyone anymore. By the time the demolition was complete, a new possibility had begun to take shape. It started as a conversation between Thomas and Mrs. Catherine Mills, who had visited Oliver in the hospital and been struck, as others had been, by the child's quiet dignity. "What will you do with the land?" Mrs. Mills had asked. Thomas hadn't known. He'd inherited the cottage, but beyond that, had no plans. The property held nothing but memories of his wife's final months and his son's suffering. "We receive regular disclosures about children," Mrs. Mills had continued. "Children in crisis, children without homes, children whose circumstances are not dissimilar to Oliver. There is an enormous need in this region for secure housing, for protective environments. I've always thought that if one had the resources and the will, one could create something meaningful." The idea had taken root. Within weeks, Thomas had begun researching. He had connected with social services, with child protection charities, with organizations that worked in the space between tragedy and recovery. What emerged was a vision of a residential home for children who had experienced abuse and neglect, a place where trauma could be acknowledged and processed, where safety could be rebuilt systematically, where the mistakes that had been made in Oliver's case could potentially be prevented for others. The project attracted funding from unexpected sources. Journalists who covered Oliver's story began receiving queries from readers who wanted to donate. A local celebrity who had grown up in similar circumstances pledged significant financial support. A building firm offered to donate labor for the renovation and new construction. What had been destruction became transformation. Where the cottage had stood, a modern, purpose-built facility began to take shape. It was designed with input from child psychologists, social workers, and crucially from Oliver himself, who, despite his young age, had clear insights into what made a space feel safe versus institutional. The result was something that looked less like a care facility and more like a well-appointed family home, extended to accommodate 30 children. There were common areas designed for community. There were quiet spaces designed for solitude. There were gardens where children could simply exist without being observed or judged. And everywhere, in subtle ways, there were signs of care: artwork on walls, books on shelves, small touches that said this was a place where children mattered. It would take 18 months to complete. During that time, Thomas remained Oliver's sole focus. He had taken a position as a facilities manager at a local hospital, work that paid adequately and allowed him the flexibility he needed. Every day, he would collect Oliver from school. Every evening, they would spend time together. Every weekend, they began to rebuild the relationship that had been fractured by grief and distance, and, ultimately, catastrophe. Oliver carried his rosary still, but he began to carry other things as well: toys, books, the ordinary accoutrements of childhood. He started to sleep through the night without nightmares, though those nights were still more common than nights without them. He began to engage with other children at school, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence. Mrs. Mills had continued her advocacy, ensuring that Oliver received appropriate educational support and psychological care. She had also become something like a surrogate grandmother figure, someone who would visit regularly, who would listen to Oliver's accounts of his weeks, who represented the possibility that adults could be both attentive and trustworthy. Whitby, as a community, had experienced something close to a reckoning. The case had been covered extensively by local media and eventually by national outlets. Features had been written about systemic failures, about how a child could be abused and neglected in plain sight without intervention. The local council had implemented new protocols for welfare checks. Social services had been provided with additional funding. Teachers had received updated training on indicators of abuse. The tragedy, though it remained a tragedy, had catalyzed change. By the autumn, Oliver began to visit construction site. Thomas would take him on weekends, and they would watch the building transform. Oliver seemed fascinated by the process, the way structure emerged from chaos, the way careful intention could create something beautiful from something that had been destroyed. "Will other children live here?" Oliver asked one Saturday, as they watched workers install windows in what would become the communal sleeping area. "Yes," Thomas said. "Children like you, who have been hurt or scared, or who don't have homes. They'll come here, and we'll take care of them. We'll make sure they know they're safe." "Will they have rosaries?" Oliver asked. "Some might," Thomas replied. "Others might have different things that are important to them. But everyone will have something that helps them remember that they're not alone." Oliver nodded solemnly, processing this. Then he said something that would stay with Thomas for the rest of his life. "I think Mummy would like that." The facility that emerged from the moorland in early 2025 was named Beacon Hauser Reference, both to the lighthouses that punctuate the Yorkshire coastline and to the idea that light could guide one through darkness. The formal opening was scheduled for a Saturday in March, with local dignitaries, journalists, and members of the community invited to bear witness to what had grown from catastrophe. Oliver, now 6 years old, had been consulted about virtually every aspect of the project, not in a token fashion, but in a genuine way. His preferences about colors, his thoughts about garden design, his input on policies that would govern how children were treated. Adults who worked with him noted that he possessed an unusual clarity about what mattered, about what would make a child feel protected versus exposed. The morning of the opening, Thomas drove Oliver to the site. The boy was dressed in a formal shirt and trousers, looking far more grown-up than 6 warranted. Around his wrist, the rosary was visible. He had begun wearing it openly, no longer hiding it, no longer treating it as shameful evidence of need. "Are you nervous?" Thomas asked, as they pulled into the car park. "A little," Oliver admitted, "but good nervous. Like opening a present." Inside the facility, everything was exactly as planned. The walls featured art created by local school children. The gardens had been planted with a mix of formal landscaping and wild spaces. The communal kitchen smelt of freshly baked bread. And in the central common area, a plaque had been installed, reading, "Beacon House, where survival becomes purpose, where pain becomes wisdom, where every child is reminded that they are not alone." Thomas had wanted to add Oliver's name, had wanted the world to know whose story had catalyzed this. But Oliver had refused. "It's not about me," the boy had said with surprising firmness. "It's about the children who come after." The opening ceremony was brief and respectful. The local MP gave remarks. A child psychologist spoke about the importance of sanctuary spaces. And then, unexpectedly, Oliver had asked to say something. Standing on a small platform, looking very small indeed, he had held up his rosary and spoken with the kind of clarity that made the gathered adults go very quiet. "My mummy gave me this," he said, his voice carrying across the space. "She told me to hold on to it, especially when I'm scared, and I'm not scared anymore. Not as much. And I think what we've built here, this place, is like a bigger kind of rosary. It's something that reminds children that they're not alone, that someone is listening, that even when things are dark, there's a reason to keep holding on." He paused, seeming to search for the right conclusion. "Then, I think my mummy would have liked to be part of this, and I think she is, somehow. I think she's here." Beside him, Thomas felt tears moving down his face. In the audience, Mrs. Mills reached for the tissue she had brought, anticipating this moment. And around the room, people who had come to celebrate infrastructure and systems found themselves instead encountering something more fundamental: the resilience of a child, the redemptive possibility of community, the way love could persist across the barrier of death. When the ribbon was officially cut, it was Oliver who wielded the scissors. And when children, the first intake of 8 young people, all with their own stories of survival, were introduced to their new home, it was Oliver who greeted them, not as a guide or an expert, but as someone who understood in his bones what they were experiencing, who could offer not wisdom but companionship. One girl, 7 years old, who had been removed from an abusive household just weeks before, asked Oliver, "Is it always going to feel like something bad is happening?" Oliver thought about this very carefully. Then he said, "No, it gets smaller. The scared part. It's still there, but other things grow bigger too, like playing and laughing and knowing someone's going to be there in the morning." "How long does it take?" the girl asked. "I don't know," Oliver said honestly. "I'm still in the middle of it, but I think that's okay. I think we get to be in the middle for as long as we need." That night, after all the visitors had left, Thomas and Oliver sat together in the garden. The March evening was cool, but not cold, and the sky was beginning to show the first hints of spring color. "You were very brave today," Thomas said. "I wasn't brave," Oliver corrected gently. "Brave is when you're scared and you keep going anyway. I wasn't scared. No. Because I knew you were there. I knew Mrs. Mills was there. I knew Mummy was there." He touched his rosary. "And I knew all those children were going to be okay, because this place is going to help them, like it helped me." Thomas pulled his son close, marveling, as he did every day, at the fact that Oliver existed at all. That, against every statistical probability, against every calculation of loss, this child had survived and had transformed survival into purpose. "I love you," Thomas said. "I love you too, Dad," Oliver replied. "I think Mummy knew you would say that. I think that's why she held on to me in the fire." And there, in the gathering darkness of a Yorkshire evening, with lights beginning to glow inside the new facility, a father and son sat together in the knowledge that love was not simply emotional abstraction. It was the most material force on earth. It was the reason a child had crawled through impossible darkness. It was the reason he had emerged alive. It was the reason that from ashes something new could grow. The boy who was supposed to have died in a fire is now a man. Oliver Bennett is 16 years old, tall and serious in the way that teenagers who have encountered genuine darkness tend to be. He is a student at the secondary school in Whitby, studying intensively in preparation for his GCSEs. He volunteers at Beacon House every Saturday. The facility has expanded. What began as a 30-bed residential home has grown into a comprehensive campus. There are now 45 permanent beds. There is a dedicated school on site for children who need educational support. There is a therapeutic wing staffed by psychiatrists and psychologists. And there are partnerships with schools across the region, ensuring that Beacon House functions not as an island, but as a hub within a larger ecosystem of child protection. Thomas Bennett is the Director of Operations. He has turned what was meant to be a personal project of redemption into a professional calling. His expertise in facility management has been instrumental in creating systems that genuinely work, that protect children while also respecting their autonomy, that process trauma while also celebrating resilience. Margaret has been released from prison after serving 7 years. She lives in Sheffield under supervision, and she has made no attempt to contact Oliver or Thomas. That chapter has been closed, filed away in the archives of consequence. James Walker, the firefighter who discovered Oliver alive in that field, retired 3 years ago. He visits Beacon House occasionally and has told his story to incoming staff, a story of witnessing the impossible, of being humbled by survival. He no longer questions why some people live and others die. He simply accepts that occasionally the universe produces exceptions. Mrs. Catherine Mills passed away 2 years ago, at the age of 82. Her funeral was attended by dozens of former students, including Oliver, who wept openly and spoke about how her insistence on seeing him, her refusal to accept comfortable lies, had helped save his life. A scholarship fund has been established in her name at the secondary school, supporting children who face barriers to education. Oliver carries his rosary still. It is visibly worn now, the beads smoothed from 12 years of use, the string replaced several times. But the object itself, the physical, tangible connection to his mother, remains intact. He wears it not as a symbol of trauma, though it undeniably was, but as a symbol of persistence, of the fact that some promises once made are never broken, that love transcends death, that faith is not about the absence of pain, but about the conviction that pain can be transformed. On a Friday evening in March, Oliver stands in the garden at Beacon House, the same garden that had been nothing but rubble and memory 12 years ago. He is preparing to speak to a group of newly admitted children about his story. This has become a regular occurrence. He is something like a living monument to what is possible, a proof that survival can lead somewhere other than merely continued existence. Before he speaks, He sits alone for a moment beneath an old oak tree. He reaches down and touches the small plaque that has been installed there, barely visible. Just a small bronze square embedded in the earth, in memory of Elena Bennett, beloved mother, whose love reached across death itself. I'm going to tell them tonight. Oliver says to the plaque, to the tree, to the moorland beyond, to whatever force it was that held him in that impossible night. I'm going to tell them about the fire, about being locked in, about the darkness, and about how you came and got me, about how you didn't let me go like you promised. He pauses, and in that pause is the accumulated weight of 12 years. 12 years of therapy, of nightmares, of slow healing, of learning to trust again, of rebuilding his sense of what was possible. And I am going to tell them that they are going to be okay too. That being saved doesn't mean the hurt stops, but it means they won't be alone in the hurt anymore. It means there are people here who will listen, who will believe them, who will hold on to them like you held on to me. Oliver stands, pockets the rosary, and walks toward the building. Inside, there are children waiting at new residents, all carrying their own stories of darkness, their own survival accounts. They are waiting to hear from someone who understands not in theory, but in the most intimate way possible what they are experiencing. When Oliver enters the room, the children look up. They see a teenager. They see someone who is not that different from them in many ways. But they also see, perhaps, something else, a person who has been through the fire and emerged whole. Not untouched, no one survives trauma untouched, but transformed into something that resembles hope. He sits among them, not above them, and begins to speak. My name is Oliver Bennett, and I was supposed to die when I was 4 years old. And the strange thing is, I almost did, but I didn't. And I'm here 12 years later, and I want to tell you why that matters for your story too. As he speaks, the rosary in his pocket seems to pulse with something like warmth, or perhaps there's only memory, only the accumulated weight of everything that object has witnessed and survived. Outside, the Yorkshire evening draws to a close. The lighthouse beams begin their nightly work, cutting through darkness, guiding the lost towards safety. And at Beacon House, in a room filled with young people who've seen more pain than any child should endure, a story is being told, a story of fire and faith, of miracles that don't come from heaven but rise from the ashes we survive, a story that says, you will be okay. Not immediately, not without struggle, but you will be okay. Because you are not alone. Because there are people here who believe in you. Because your life, your survival, your presence in this world, it all matters. The rosary, in its worn and weathered state, bears witness to this truth. It bears witness, as all objects do, when they have been held by hands that refuse to let go, to the remarkable human capacity for resilience, for love, for transformation. Fire doesn't always destroy. Sometimes it purifies. Sometimes it illuminates. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, if you hold on very tightly to the things that matter most, it becomes the beginning of everything beautiful that comes after. If this story touched your heart, leave a candle emoji in the comments and tell us, do you believe in miracles? Like, subscribe, and let us know from which country you're watching, because every story of pain deserves to be heard.